thank you very much for agreeing for the interview. It's been a pleasure to see to your kind of listen to your talks here as well. And I know that you recently been to a new space event in Luxembourg as well.
Right.
And everyone is talking about new space, but it's kind of very difficult to define what new space is. So what is it for you, new space?
Well, for one thing, it's an opportunity to bring in a whole new range of creative thinking, different paradigms of thinking. Economically, it really reflects a change from a period of time where almost all the financial risk of a space project was borne by public funds, by governments. Now increasingly large portions of space projects represent very real financial risk, traditional capitalist risk. You think of the major firms that are getting a lot of attention these days, SpaceX, Orbital, Planet, Deep Space Industries, Planetary Resources. All these companies really could stand to lose money, whereas in the early days of the space race and then the evolution of space towards station and shuttle, companies generally had contracts which covered their cost and let them make a little money. It was a different kind of partnership with government. Now you see more autonomy with new space. The entrepreneurs get to make more choices about what they want to focus on, but they also stand to lose a very large amount of money. And so for that reason, it's meant that the early stage of new space has been sponsored by people who have a lot of money to lose.
And this change from the public money to private money and maybe something new in the future, is it a good change for the industry?
I think it is. I mean, it brings more ideas, more concepts into the pursuit of evolving human experience of space. The only part of it that I find a little unhealthy is this attempt to make a huge difference between what government is doing and what new space is doing and what the older large-scale integrator companies are doing. Frankly, new space ought to be seen as the reinforcements that are arriving to help us handle a problem that is just much, much bigger than any one company can handle. And it's a problem that's been created by all the discoveries we've made that have led to new questions. So this is a new opportunity for partnership, and I'm pretty optimistic about it.
So some people express concerns about possibilities of future public and private cooperation, especially when we talk about things like IP, who owns future space resources and things like that. How do you see the future of space exploration in that regards? Who is going to own the resources, for example, on the Moon or asteroids? Do we have to change our legislation, or you believe that we can use the existing framework of what we already have?
Well, I think we can certainly begin with the existing framework. The Outer Space Treaty in particular is a treaty on principles. It was designed to be very flexible. If we're looking for a world in which all of us agree absolutely on every interpretation, well, we're not going to find it. And we could quintuple the number of words in the Outer Space Treaty, and we'd still have things to disagree about. Yeah. So I think the Outer Space Treaty will be a fairly good foundation as we gain more experience, as we recognize where the real problems are, then I think we'll have a real incentive to resolve them. It's what the Space Resources Governance Working Group that I've been involved with calls adaptive governance. Adapt to what you need to make rules about rather than trying to make rules about everything in advance. I don't even think is going to be so much of a choice as the natural default option. There are so many creative ideas now for going to space and doing something in space that it seems to be irrationally pessimistic to assume that none of them will succeed. And as the first ones do succeed, they will generate pathway for other successes. So, you know, in the sequence of questions you asked, I mean, IP may, in fact, we may find that IP ends up changing with the experience of space. Well, the biggest change I could imagine is that the period of time in which an idea is protected may well end up becoming shorter. The opportunity to use trade secret is going to be much less because, you know, from millions of miles away, you can see what your competitor's doing, and so it will probably change the way we think about IP.
And when we talk about millions of miles away, do you believe that economic and social structures on the moon, other planets like Mars, will have to be the same as on Earth, or we have to come up with new economic models, with a new, even social organization of society, which will be up there?
Yeah, maybe I'm a victim of having read too much science fiction, but science fiction authors have struggled with this issue of how is society transformed by being distant from Earth for quite some time. And I often recommend to people a remarkable book by Robert Heinlein called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And it's interesting because it's a good read, it's a nicely written book, but it also really makes you think about how society might evolve, how behavior changes, how a sense of your personal and social interest can be impacted by your distance from Earth. I'm sure that the first voyagers from England to what became North America weren't thinking about separating from England, but eventually they felt that they wanted to do that, and after some unpleasantness it happened. And it would be awfully hard for me to believe that Earth is going to retain control of every one of the societies that it might inspire somewhere else in the solar system, and then maybe elsewhere beyond the solar system. But social change is something that we should be used to, get accustomed to in space activity, I think.
Yes. And obviously we discussed that there is definitely a change in the space economics, so moving from public money to private money. But still, from what I see, investors are struggling to get sort of returns from the space industry in terms of, at least in the short term.
Right.
So do you believe that we should be kind of trying to discover new economic models, how we can kind of build something new?
Well, you know, in years of teaching at ISU, I would often tell students that if they're building a business plan for space, they need to build into it intermediate cash flows. That is, they need to build in an understanding that if they are creative enough, a lot of what they want to do in space will have early steps that solve problems on Earth. And the problems that they solve on Earth can generate cash while they're trying to solve the bigger dream problem, the so-called horizon goal that they may have. And you know, think about how that's beginning to happen now. People are developing possible habitats for lunar or Martian settlement, and then seeing how they could play a role in communities affected by disaster or even by long-term chronic poverty. People are trying to find ways to develop sources of water out of what appears to be dry dirt. Yes. Well, there are plenty of places on Earth where that could be a very handy skill. We're learning on the space station so much about human physiology and solutions and even causative agents for disease. Solving the problem on Earth can generate income that enables you to do more research in space. So the model that needs to be developed is a sense that you can't get target fixation. You can't say, oh, what I want is this habitat on the surface of the moon or Mars, and that's all I'm going to focus on. You need to recognize that we have always been resource constrained as a species. Managing constrained resources is going to be a great skill for operating in the frontier days of space settlement, and has enormous returns to pay for the one place on, in the solar system where we know for a fact that life can be supported, planet Earth. We can support it too. Earth is a planet. It can be treated as a space mission.
Very interesting. So in the past, we had public involved with the space exploration during the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of broadcasting, people were reading books, attending lectures, and at the moment, well, here at ICU, it's still happening, but if you talk about other places on Earth, people are less aware of what's happening in space, why we should do that. Do you believe that that attitude has to change if you want to progress and go to the moon and Mars?
Well, I mean, what has changed is the way people are perceiving space activity. In the United States, for example, where there's currently not an American national capability of sending an astronaut to space. I've been asked occasionally by people, although I must say less frequently than I once was asked, why did America abandon the space program? Well, what they're really asking me is, why aren't we sending our own astronauts to space anymore? Yes. But a number of things have begun to change that paradigm. The fairly clever personification, for example, of spirit, opportunity, and curiosity. Robots, roving robots on the surface of Mars that have developed such a personality that children cried when Spirit died. And NASA had sort of the good sense to not try to disabuse people of whether a machine can die, because they sort of understood. People had developed an emotional attachment to it. The Europeans did a positively brilliant job with Philae. This little lander on Gerasimov-Gerasimenko absolutely incredibly captured the imaginations of people. They personified it, though. They made it into a little robot. It was like that robot Nono that was part of cartoons in Europe for so long. There was just this sense that there was something almost lovable about it. The Chinese with U2, with the Jade Rabbit. Yeah. Same thing. I mean, they actually had it send a final message to Earth. Oh my goodness, you could imagine a billion Chinese crying at once that this wasn't going to wake up from a lunar winter. So people are paying attention. An enormous number of people paid attention to the Pluto flyby. Yes. And I think a lot of people have plugged into the NASA site to see the final pictures of Cassini as it augured in and into the Saturnian atmosphere, and now Juno at Jupiter. I think we can speak too quickly about whether people are plugged into space. The question is, how open are they to the reality of sending humans to a fairly hostile environment where some of them are going to not make it? We tolerate thousands of people killed on the highways every year, but we seem to be reluctant to accept the fact that going to the moon or going to Mars is dangerous. Fortunately, we are not short of volunteers to do it.
Yeah. So do you believe that in the future you might see more sort of direct participation of citizens in space programs? So, for example, just recently I talked to one of the ISU students, and he suggested that why don't we have like space flight lottery, so people can play, and then someone goes to to orbit?
Well, you know, I suspect that that kind of idea can play into the reality that there is probably some price at which a very large number of people would make a pretty considerable sacrifice of wealth to go to orbit. We already know that there's a market to take a suborbital flight where you could have maybe no more than 5 minutes of weightlessness and maybe 8 or 9 of black space.
Yes.
There's almost certainly a price at which people would be willing to go to orbit. For most people, it's not going to be the $25 to $35 million that it seems to cost now with insurance.
Yes.
But a lottery where people say, well, for 1 in 10,000 chance of going to orbit, I'll put down $25,000. I suspect there probably is a group of people who would do that.
And what about things like crowdfunding, for example? What do you think?
Well, you know, with crowdfunding, obviously, you've got to figure out what's motivating the crowd.
Sure.
So the idea maybe of sending a teacher from your country to space, that might be crowdfunded. Mm-hmm. The idea of sending, you know, me, a senior citizen to space because I want to go to space, well, it's a little tougher to make the crowdfunding case for that.
Do you want to go to space?
Well, you know, I would be very interested in going to orbit. It's an interesting question because I've been asked it several times. I'm less interested in a suborbital flight. Mm-hmm. and because just getting to space, I think I'd lose my mind. I mean, in 5 minutes, my head would probably spin around so many times I wouldn't be able to go back on straight. I'd be trying to look at everything. Maybe a week in orbit, that could be interesting. Unfortunately, at the current price, I'm not quite sure I'm going to be able to afford that. But I'm pretty confident that that price is going to come down. And when you realize it, I mean, let's just say the price is $35 million to go to orbit, which with insurance, that might be about right. 20 years ago, you know what the price was? Infinite. You couldn't do it. Not available. There was no supply. And so we've gone from infinitely expensive down to around $35 million. When we start having more options like Dream Chaser and Dragon and Cygnus and all of these with human transportation versions, maybe even Orion, as people start to say that there's money involved in flying maybe 1 professional astronaut and 4 passengers, you start getting the price point down. Competition takes away the margin a little bit, and you'll start to see the prices come down. You find ads from the late 19-teens that say you could take a flight for $50 or $100. That was a lot of money then, and it didn't last very long. It didn't last even the 4 total hours that a Virgin Galactic flight would last.
So the final question. Do you believe that space exploration is important to kind of better have a different self-consciousness as human beings here on Earth, and to kind of have different perceptions of why we're here on this planet and where we should be heading?
Well, I think space exploration is a major pathway to perspective. Human beings seem to be able to derive good conclusions out of data best when they have comparisons to make. We try to create comparative forms of almost every intellectual discipline. And, you know, we really only know one planet reasonably well, and that's planet Earth. We're learning a fair amount about Mars. We probably know more about Mars than we do about the Moon. We know a little bit about Venus, and about the rest, you know, we're learning. And so as we explore, we gain that perspective. You know, we discovered the effect of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas on Venus. We're learning interesting things about the way a planet can lose its atmosphere and lose its surface water on Mars. We weren't going to learn that on Earth. In orbit in the space station, we learn what the cause of osteoporosis is, and we're beginning to do some interesting work in developing potential therapies for osteoporosis. There's a gravitational link to osteoporosis, so we had to get away from gravity to be able to recognize that that was hiding the cause. And so exploration for everybody means that the possibility of understanding this planet better is dramatically improved because we get comparative data. For the really curious, it's a chance to open up a whole new range of questions about the nature of where we came from and are we alone in the universe that we're not going to answer inside this thin envelope of atmosphere that we've got around our home planet. And that, I think, is something that is a very natural behavior for people, but it also has huge benefits to folks whose lives will be impacted favorably by what we discover when we get perspective and comparative data and an opportunity to understand what is happening in our own planet, because we understand better what's happening on ours.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to mention? Or?
No, but great to meet you,
great
to have an opportunity here to meet all the people with Moon Village Association, and we hope this will be a successful effort to see what human life might be like if there were a settlement on the moon.
Absolutely, yes, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Yep. Okay.